our community conversation with Ramsey County Attorney John Choi here. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming. I guess from my understanding, John, you have some slides to share with us?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much for the invitation. Actually, this is like the first time that the Highland District Council has invited me to come and speak. And so I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to engage in some important conversations. First of all, I want to acknowledge that, as a fellow Highland resident, I live down by River Road by the Hidden Falls entrance. I live on right up the hill on Colby. And I know that there's a lot of things that are happening in our community that is, I think, generating rightfully a lot of concern and fear about rising levels of crime and things that are happening with respect to our youth and also adults who are reoffending. And so I wanted to present some information so that all of you kind of have similar types of information that I have, and to try to help you understand maybe some of the things that are happening, and also to be able to have all the information relative to just what people might be talking about the reasons why we're having kind of what I would describe as certainly a spike in some really high profile violent incidents, and also a rise in crime, I would say, starting in about late 2019. So with that, what I'll do is I'm going to start with sharing some information with you, and I plan to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'd like to be able to answer all of your questions tonight, and I also can stay as long as necessary to get through all of those questions. So first, I'm going to go to this slide here. And so what I want to first of all talk about is that the role of the prosecutor. So, our job is in many ways on the very, very back end. We're not involved in policing. Our job is not primarily to be on the ground level dealing with all of the incidents that are happening, right? We get presented with information, and it's our job to determine whether or not, if it's at the adult level, a felony crime has occurred. Our jurisdiction only goes to felony crime. We don't handle the misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor cases. Those cases would be handled by the city attorney's office. And then with regard to juvenile crime, anything, whether it's a petty misdemeanor, or gross misdemeanor, or felony, any level, we have jurisdiction over that. And so our job is to determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence to proceed with a petition or a criminal charge. And if so, then we would prosecute that case. And as all of you know, in the midst of the pandemic, a lot of things have challenged the court system. For a big part of 2020, we didn't have court hearings. We didn't have jury trials. In fact, we went through probably a 6-month period where we had none. And so that has caused lots of challenges where, the cases on the front end, as they're being presented to us by the police, that hasn't stopped at all. The cases keep coming to us, but they're all piling up in the context of there's no resolution with regard to these cases, because we haven't had the ability to have jury trials like we did prior to the pandemic. Typically, at any one time for felonies at the adult level, we would probably have at least 4 trials happening at any one particular time. There have been times during this pandemic where there have been none. And in order to get cases resolved, oftentimes you need the pressure of a trial to get the defense to actually engage in conversations around resolution. Oftentimes they're not going to want to resolve their case because they know that the time is going to benefit, I guess, from their client's perspective. So the first slide that I have for you is, and I want to make this very clear, this is not crime data. This is just my data. And again, I'm at the very, very, very back end. This is what police present to us. And so the red line is a reflection of kind of what's been coming in the door on the adult side. So any felony crime over the age of 18, we do have jurisdiction over some gross misdemeanors that the legislature has given us. But for the most part, as you can see, the volume of cases coming in our front door is about the same. And then the cases that we charge, and historically, ever since I've been the county attorney, we've historically had a charging rate of about 60%. So 60% of the cases that the police present to us, we charge. And then the 40%, we either decline because there's just insufficient evidence with respect to that case, or we don't think that it's a felony level case, and the case is referred to the city attorney. And the city attorney will have that. And so historically, for as long as I've been the county attorney, we've had a charging rate of about 60%. Prior to becoming the county attorney back in 2011, the office had a charging rate of about 49%. So that's just generally data. And as you can see, there's not much of a change, even despite the pandemic. These next slides are just kind of the lines in isolation, but then I want all of you to look at the youth cases that, again, we're at the very, very back end, right? And so, and typically our charging rate for youth cases is about a little bit higher. It's usually about 65%, but again, the red line represents what police have sent to us, and the blue line represents the cases in which we've actually filed a petition for the court to adjudicate the situation. So interestingly here, with respect to youth cases, we've had a huge drop of cases that have been presented to our office for us to do something about. And I think there was part of this is because the St. Paul Police Department, and they've been under just immense strain and stress during this pandemic this past year, with being called into action to help with civil unrest. And also, I think some resource issues, people retiring and not being able to fill those positions. They disbanded their juvenile unit probably back in April or May. So that could be partially a cause of the cases not coming to our attention. But that's just the data that I have. And again, this is not crime data. It doesn't mean that youth crime is going down whatsoever. It just means this is what is the police are asking us to look at. I wish that historically that we had a thing that we could measure, like carjackings. Carjackings is something that we've been hearing a lot about in the news. We don't have a code for carjacking, but typically if there's a carjacking type of situation, it will come in as usually a motor vehicle theft case and an aggravated robbery or some form of a robbery. If there wasn't a gun or a dangerous weapon used, then it would be a simple robbery. And so I'm going to show you some of that data. And so as you can see, for the motor vehicle theft cases, I would say that during this pandemic, we've had a little bit of an uptick, but generally about the same over time. And the pink parts of these graphs represent the pandemic period, right? And so I see a little bit of an uptick in these types of motor vehicle theft cases. And across the country, there's been a huge uptick with regard to motor vehicle theft cases around the country. But then we see the same thing happening on the youth side. For some reason, these cases are not being presented necessarily to our office for some particular action. And again, the numbers for youth involved with motor vehicle theft has always been relatively slow. The actual numbers are on the far left-hand column there. You see the 0, 5, 10. So the range has been somewhere, as a high of 20, but that was at 19. Or a little bit above 20, 25 maybe. But then you see kind of a drop. And again, this is not crime data. This is just like data that, in terms of what we're asked to respond to. And then if we look for aggravated robbery cases, because if we're talking about carjacking, typically it would involve some aspect of also charging out robbery. And as you can see here, this is where maybe it's reflected. We see certainly an increase on the adult side, and on the juvenile side, I think historically it's been somewhat the same, but there's somewhat of an uptick there during the pandemic period, right? And then for simple robbery, these are just the numbers. Sometimes the meaning of all of this is, but it's just good information and data for you to understand. And then so on the simple robbery cases, on the adult side, I see an uptick, but on the youth side, I don't. And again, these numbers have always historically been really low across Ramsey County. So on the very far left corner of the screen, you see the actual numbers. And these are, by the way, are obviously all monthly types of numbers. This is murder cases. We've got a whole bunch of them. We have way too many murders and innocent people losing their lives. But this just reflects some of that. I think I want to get to some of the other more important issues about, this is just firearm cases, people who are ineligible to actually possess a firearm. Again, you see an uptick, I think, a little bit during the pandemic. Sometimes people talk about some policies that maybe the county attorney has, and I'll take full ownership of one particular policy that we have in our office. Back in May of 2020, I made the decision that I instructed my staff that if they had a pending fifth degree drug possession case, this is a low level drug charge. It's probably the lowest priority felony in my office, that if you had one of those pending, or if something were to be presented to you, that you should decline to prosecute or dismiss those cases. And because the reality is these cases would never, ever see the light of day. They would not be tried before a jury, and we'll never get to them. And I also believe that we should be thinking about how we don't criminalize addiction, and we start thinking about other strategies outside of the criminal justice system to deal with these very, very low level felony cases. And quite frankly, I think they should be at the misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor level, but unfortunately the legislature really hasn't provided very many options. But this is something that I feel very strongly about, and we're going to continue this throughout the pandemic because we don't have the time or the resources to handle these particular cases. However, I want to make this very clear that we do have a public safety exception, and we have charged out some drug sale, drug possession cases at the lowest level. If the police articulate to us why it is so critical that these cases have to be prosecuted. And so there's been some cases that have been prosecuted during this time period. One of the things that is true, and I think this is a really important piece of information that I think we all need to be thinking about, and actually the system, I think, needs to do a better job, as well as community organizations that are involved with our people who are getting connected to the justice system. But we've heard a lot about repetitive conduct, criminal behavior, right? And that is very true. In 2020, as you can see, we've had on the adult, this is the adult slide, but as you can see, we've had an increase of people who are coming in a calendar year on more than one occasion, right? So you see the numbers are generally steady, and I think generally speaking, if you went back, further, it would generally be about the same. But in 2020, we see an increase in these particular numbers of people who have been in our office or been come to our attention more than 5 times, more than 4 times, more than 3 times, more than 2 times, right? So I think this is an area that I think that we all need to be thinking about, and how to think about strategizing about how to address some of these issues. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in my remarks. And then on the youth side of things, as you can see, same thing. In 2020, we've had an increase of a small number of individuals who are coming to our attention on a very, very frequent basis, right? And I think this tells us a lot about just where we need to really stress and put our resources on. And it's not just the resources of arrest and prosecution and having the court system involved, but there's other things that I think we as a community need to really be paying attention to. Just as an example, I'll give you some 10-year historical data. One of the things I want all of you to know about the juvenile justice system is that the vast 2/3 of the people who get referred to our office just one time, they never come back. They never come back. it's really there's a small, and as you go up this triangle, there's this smaller and smaller amounts of people and kids in this particular instance that are typically coming to our office on multiple occasions. And I will tell you something about these kids and the families in which they come. They come from very traumatic backgrounds where there's just a lot of stress going on in their lives and in their families, instability with regard to economic situation, housing, et cetera. And so I think this is where some of the focus, I hope, can be, in terms of how our county social service agencies and the work that needs to be done to really focus on this particular population. This is just another slide of it, but we've got kids who've been referred to our office 43 times. And I want to make it clear that there are limitations about what we can do on the youth side. We're a lot of times these referrals, unless it involves a very, very serious crime, like for instance, you kill somebody, they're going to be handled in juvenile court. And I think there's this perception that somehow referring the matter to court will solve all of the issues. And quite frankly, just like as police have been asked to do way too many things, I think our court system and the juvenile justice system oftentimes is asked to do way, way too many things as well. I think one of the things that's driving some of the repeat conduct that I want to talk a little bit about is some of the things that we're doing around the jail. But I also think that it's being done in a very responsible way. The jail is operated by our sheriff. The sheriff's office runs our adult detention center. And at the beginning part of the COVID-19 pandemic, the sheriff, myself, the chief judge, the public defender, and others recognized that we had a public health issue with regard to having just too high of a population in our jail. And so we did take some action early on in the pandemic. One of the things that we did is that we gave the sheriff authority to release people if they felt the person did not have to stay within the jail. Now, these are very low level offenses. These are misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, nonviolent misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, and nonviolent low level felony types of cases. And utilizing that, we were able to reduce some of the population in our jail. But I also know that there have been instances where some of those individuals may have committed certain crimes. And so those are things that we're trying to pay attention to as much as we can. But again, this is what is some of the data that we have. So this is the top one, the adult detention center. And keep in mind that everybody in the adult detention center, they have not been convicted of anything. Okay, these are individuals who get brought to the jail, they're booked, and then they're put into the jail until the prosecutor can make a determination. And then we have a first appearance, and at that hearing, we determine whether what the bail should be, right? And so we all have, this is very American, but we have a cash bail system in the United States since the beginning of our country. And I think some of the things that are happening today kind of underscore and expose really kind of the ineffectiveness of the cash bail system, and I'll explain why. And also too, it's just highly inequitable. We do this dance around people who have not yet been convicted, and we try to impose some form of a bail amount, but the Constitution says, and the cases say, that we can't punish people before they've been convicted, and they have an absolute right to post cash bail. So if a bail amount is imposed, they can get out without any conditions if they have the money. And historically, many communities that have been brought to the jail didn't have the money. And so we had higher populations of pre-conviction detention. But today, because of an organization called the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which raised about $36 million post George Floyd, they have been posting cash bail for individuals in the adult jails in Hennepin and Ramsey County to the tune of $10, $20, $30, $40, and even $50,000. if we argued for and we were successful to get bail in anywhere above like $10,000, those are pretty serious cases. The good news is that a lot of people have been having conversations with the Minnesota Freedom Fund about what they're doing. What they're doing is they're trying to expose the cash bail system for what it is, but they're doing it at the expense of the community and essentially because we don't have an alternative to the cash bail system. But they have now agreed, based upon the number of meetings that have occurred, that they no longer will post cash bail for individuals in Ramsey County for those individuals who are accused of felonies. So they'll have to figure out ways to get money on their own, or they're going to have to use the bail bond industry, which is also a very oppressive industry. And that's for a presentation for another day. However, I think that will provide some relief to some of the individuals that have been released pre-detention and, from my perspective, should not have, and we would have asked for a high bail in those particular cases. I think it would be great right now. I don't know if Sarah Cory, my staff person, did end up coming onto the call. Sarah, are you there? If she's not, I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to share another screen. And let's see if I can find the right. Oh, here we go. So this is the criminal history of three individuals, Mr. McFarland, Mr. York, and Mr. Love. And so I want to talk about McFarland first. So this is an individual that has a lot of repeated criminal activity. And so his connections to the justice system start in Hennepin County, where, he's basically, charged with burglary in the first degree, third degree. I'm not sure why on the third one they charged him by summons. Summons is you mail something to someone. A warrant is you ask police to go and find them. But anyways, it comes to our attention first on November 9th. And there right away, $20,000 is the cash bail amount, which is a higher amount. And bail was posted for him. And so the Minnesota Freedom Fund, yes.
Just sorry to interrupt. I think you're maybe sharing the wrong screen. We're seeing just your email.
Oh, okay. So let me see if I can, thank you for that.
Yes,
Let me
sir.
see if I can figure out how to share the right screen. So I'm going to stop. So I'm looking at something that has that information. So let me go back and see if I can find that Excel. So here we go. Now, can you see it?
That's correct. Yes.
Oh, good. So let's focus on the bottom person, Mr. McFarland. This is somebody that, people have been talking about a repeat behavior, right? But on 11/13, he posted $20,000 bail. And so I want to make this really clear to people that you and I and everybody in America has an absolute right to get out of jail pre-conviction. If you have the dough. And so what happened here is that the Minnesota Freedom Fund did post that amount of money. So he's released, but then lo and behold, he's back in the system, right? We asked for $30,000 bail, right? And I believe that we were granted that. But then right now, I don't think the history goes to what's going on now, but then we have this whole issue about Rule 20, and it shows up in these other two cases. But Rule 20 is, people who are accused of crime, they have to be able to participate in their own defense. If there are mental capacity issues that are prohibiting that, we litigate that, and then the judge will determine that. But we're running into Rule 20 issues. So in Rule 20, basically somebody will do a study and then the judge will decide. But oftentimes when somebody is ruled to be incompetent to stand trial, then that we make a referral to civil commitment court. And civil commitment court, there's a higher standard in which somebody could be committed civilly against their own will, right? And so there's oftentimes this gap between who can be committed and who's found competent or incompetent to stand trial. And we used to have a program in 2018, but it was eliminated by the state government, which was a restoration of competency program where a number of these individuals could be referred to, and we could keep them in custody and we would have services offered. So that's one of the challenges. I think the same thing can be seen here for the other individuals. York and Love are two people that have been robbing lots of, burglarizing lots of businesses. One of them was the Happy Gnome, and the victim in that case has been very outspoken. But as you can again see, Rule 20 issues play out for Mr. York. And then for Mr. Love, we get the issue of the Minnesota Freedom Fund posting bail. And again, these individuals have the absolute right to be released. But I bring up these three examples because this is very consistent across the board, what we see with respect to a lot of the individuals that are repeating the criminal conduct. But I think we've made some progress by being able to have a conversation with the Minnesota Freedom Fund to get them to realize that they're actually doing, by trying to prove a point, that they're actually harming our community. And that we should really work towards together a way to, end the cash bail system and replace it with something that would be responsible, that we could have a way to argue for people to be remaining in custody pre-conviction because they're a public safety threat or because we don't have any faith that they're going to come back to court. Those are the two permissible reasons that the Supreme Court has outlined that are allowable. And there are states that have successfully implemented cash or bail reform. One of those states would be New Jersey. I would love to have a system like New Jersey, which was started probably about 8 years ago, and it's been studied to no end. And everybody agrees that the outcomes there have actually improved public safety outcomes. So with that, maybe I should just stop and see if one more thing. I want to go back to just one more, the slide here about, I forgot to mention about, I think there's a lot of discussion about youth crime and what is going on there. And so I want to go back to this slide. This slide right here. So the top line, the black line, is what you already saw. That was the adult detention center for adults who are in their pre-conviction. So you can see because of COVID, those numbers dropped. Today, I believe that number is at about 265. But I want to draw your attention to the very bottom line, which represents the kids that are in detention. So youth who are in detention. And these numbers have been steady throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. They really haven't changed. They've been somewhere between, I'd say, 15 to about 30 kids in detention, pre-adjudication, not convicted, just there, right? But if you took this line out to 2012, the number has always remained the same. We took a very proactive measure back in 2005 to start Juvenile Detention's Alternatives Initiative to recognize that having lots of kids in detention and not really making sure that the kids that need to be there are in detention. We moved away from having pre-adjudication detention. We used to have 150 kids in detention at any one time. Today, that number since about 2012 has ranged somewhere between about 15 and 30. So there's been a dramatic reduction. But I've never heard from people about the issues of JDAI back in 2011, 12, 13, 14, when much of this change was happening. So I think I've talked about enough, and I think it's time to try to answer whatever questions that you might have.
All right, thank you, John. This is Kevin Gallatin from the Highland District Council. I'm going to moderate the comments here. I wore a special shirt for you.
Yeah, wonderful. Great to see you, Kevin. Go
Marquette,
Marquette.
Hoya.
They had a horrible basketball season this year, though.
They sure did, but there's hope ahead. So the first question comes from a community member, Candy. How can there be bail hearings now, but not trials?
How can there be bail hearings and not trials? Yeah, I think I can answer that. So the trials, in order to have a criminal trial, there needs to be 12 jurors and probably 2 alternates, right? And the person who stands accused of the felony crime has to be there. And then, of course, there's security with respect to the sheriff's deputies. There's a court reporter, there's a judge, the judge's law clerk, and then the lawyers that would represent the state's interest, my office, and then the defense. With all of those people, there are only 3 courtrooms in our courthouse that can accommodate that. And so this 18-story building in downtown is kind of useless for trials under the restrictions that the public health department has put in place. And then, of course, the Supreme Court issued a rule that said you can't have jury trials because of the pandemic. So in that case, that's why we can't have those jury trials happening. And then on the bail hearings, we can do those things sometimes remotely. We can do them in a larger courtroom where you have limited people there. So it might be just the state's Ramsey County's attorney, it might be the public defender. And once they're done, the next person is, and then so it's more easily managed. So there's less people involved in a bail type of hearing. I hope that answered the question.
Kevin, just you're unmuted.
Got it, thanks. Related question. So to what degree are courts classified as essential services during the pandemic? Like, could you give a sense of like how much operations have been hampered by it?
Oh, it's been huge. I mean, some people say that it's going to take us 3 years to unearth ourselves from the backlog. So the very front end of the system did not stop. Police kept, presenting cases, at least on the adult side. On the youth side, it kind of dripped a little bit, but so all of these, everybody has a right to a jury trial, right? Although that's kind of like the biggest lie in America, that doesn't play out that way. I mean, we only probably try about 2% of the cases. There's not enough courtrooms and judges, even pre-pandemic, to try all of them. So most everything resolves in some form of a plea negotiation. And those negotiations are always helped when the pressure of a trial date is looming. And so I think that's been one of the biggest hurdles. I mean, there's so many pending cases right now. And that's one of the reasons why we had to start thinking about like what are really not priorities for our office. Obviously, the highest priority cases are those that involve violence and things of that sort. So.
Very good, thank you. We have 3 questions queued up, so I'll just let everybody know kind of what the order is here. So we've got Randall S. has a question that I'll call on Catherine, who's designated as Catherine's iPhone here. And then we have a question from, looks like Kate Habel. So the next question is from Randall, he wrote it out. The repeat offenders are very scary to consider. What would normally happen if we were not having a pandemic?
Well, I think also too, we have to put it in the context of civil unrest. We wouldn't have a Minnesota Freedom Fund that had $36 million to work with in terms to expose the cash bail system. But I also want to make it very clear that I believe that we should abolish our cash bail system and replace it with something else. I don't necessarily agree with how they've gone about their work, but they are making some changes and reforms to how they're thinking about who they post bail for, right? And so right now they've taken the position that they're no longer going to do felonies. So I think that's a good first step. And then they can think about thinking about what they want to do moving forward. Quite frankly, I think some of the resources that they have should really be put to lobbying the legislature to create a system, an alternative to the cash bail system. I think I got lost in that answer so can you just refresh my memory of the question so I make sure I answered it?
Yeah, so it's really about the repeat offenders. They're
Yes, thank
particularly
you.
scary. Mhm.
Right. So yes, and so that is a big issue, and I think that we have to also recognize that if we're talking about youth, okay, um, uh, we should not think about it like the adult system. Um, the juvenile system very clearly is also about rehabilitation, right? And so we don't certify youth to the adult system unless they've committed a serious act, like for instance, like a murder, right? Um, Short of that, we have something called extended juvenile jurisdiction that would allow for the court to have some aspect of supervision over programming and things like that that could extend out to the 21st birthday. But for the most part, the vast majority of cases that we get in our system and that we file a petition on, oftentimes the outcome is going to be some hope and referral to our probation department, and it would be some aspect of community supervision for most of these kids. And these are the non-violent ones. And then if there's violence involved, right, oftentimes they will be sent maybe to Red Wing, which is an institution for youth offenders. But the reality is that the way that the state programming works is that nobody's ever there for more than a year. What they're doing there is intense, work with the youth and helping the rehabilitation aspect. And there's a strong desire on the part of our state corrections to have young people supervised in their community, because at the end of the day, they have to live in their community, right? And so that's the juvenile system as it is today and as it was since its inception. I think the major policy changes that have occurred in Ramsey County are on the Juvenile Detentions Alternatives Initiative. And again, that happened starting back in 2005, and it really became realized, I'd say probably around 2012, in terms of the numbers reducing around who is held in detention pre-adjudication. So again, these kids haven't been convicted of anything. So those numbers have dramatically reduced. We're also, I think there's less kids that have been put into some form of a placement, a post-adjudication. And I think there is a lot of work that can be done with respect to improving the outcomes for youth who are under extended juvenile jurisdiction. Typically, if you're in that category, you have done something that is concerning. And I think that there are conversations that need to occur about how we can get better results from our community corrections department, as well as our community, because I think that in many ways, you can't just put it all on the system of community corrections, but we have to think about how community can be more engaged and also a better resource so that they can spend more time with these kids. And also, it's not just about the kids, it's also about how do we help these families? Again, these kids are all coming from backgrounds where they have been exposed and connected to just immense amounts of trauma. In fact, many of these kids probably have a parent who has or currently is incarcerated. And so I think that's another conversation that we have to have as a community, that, we have, I think, utilized incarceration at the adult level to very high levels historically. And generationally, at some point, 10, 20 years down the road, it all comes to roost. And I think we're seeing some of that effect. And so I'd like to see a way to have better interventions and have more of a wraparound where we not just think about the youth, but also think about the entire family as well.
Thank you. I believe that question answered the one of the next ones that was coming up from Kate H. Kate, please raise your hand if that didn't completely answer it. I'm going to go ahead and call on Catherine. Catherine's iPhone was next in order, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you're welcome to ask your question or comment now.
Yes, hi, good evening. This is Kathy Bell. I am the property manager down at Sibley Manor Apartments, and I do appreciate you being here. We have had our share of I consider them violent. They might not be considered violent on your side of it, but I've had tenants that have been held up at gunpoint and their car stolen, even in the middle of the day. Our neighborhood has been a very safe neighborhood for the last 13 years, and now it is scarier than it's ever been. So when you're talking about these youth offenders, first on your spreadsheet, you were showing that the number of youth offenders is about the same as it was 12 years ago, that you're tracking. But to me, that doesn't seem to mean a lot, because I feel like there's a lot of them out there that probably aren't being tracked, or that aren't being held at this time, frankly. So in fact, in the last Villager, there was an article about one of the youth offenders who had just been arrested. He had been arrested 20 times previously, and he was currently wanted for several burglaries and carjackings. This is one kid, and I'm sure he's not the one that's doing all of this. So I know there are a lot of people, or a lot of young people kind of running amok as far as I'm concerned. And I don't think that there's anything being done about it. And frankly, I've been very worried about our tenants. And the fact that your office doesn't consider carjacking a serious crime, that they have to murder somebody in order to kind of get into the system. I just don't think that that's a very fair place to leave us as business owners and as residents of this area.
So Catherine, I also live in your area, and I will tell you that a carjacking is a violent crime. So what I would say is, and then I think you've also, heard me say, and I just want to make it very clear that we're talking about like whether or not we certify a young person as an adult, right? So that they go off to prison. We haven't been doing that unless it's for instance, a murder or something along those lines for a really long time. And so I think there are situations where we've gotten better outcomes by not sending the youth to prison. Now, I think what you're experiencing and what I'm experiencing, because I have the same types of feelings as you, is that we have to also recognize that we're in the midst of a pandemic where school has not been in session for a long time, that supports that typically were there for young people are just simply not there. And this is not in isolation. If you look around the country, where there are communities with tall buildings and pockets of poverty, this is very, very commonplace. It doesn't make me feel better, and it shouldn't make you feel better, but that's a big part of what's going on. I also think that there are the situations that you might be talking about may not have come to my attention, because the case, we get lots of cases where they don't present, they meaning the police don't present the case because they don't know who did it. But if you have, and I'm going to send to you, I just put it into the chat, my email, but if you have a CN number, okay, I want you to contact me, and I'll go through and look through anything that you want me to, and I'll give you the public information about that particular case, about, first of all, whether or not the police have found a suspect, whether they have presented the case to our office, and then what we did with the case with respect to our response. And we'll just provide in a very transparent way kind of all of that information. But what I find oftentimes is that when people do actually contact me with CN numbers, we don't have any record of the case being presented to our office. And if also too, I think that if we're believing that somehow that the court system is going to solve these particular issues, I mean, I think we're a part of the solution, but we're not the sole solution. I mean, if we want to live in a world where, we try 14, 15, 16-year-olds as adults, right, and send them off to Stillwater, well, they wouldn't be at Stillwater, with the adult population, but to the state correctional facility, I think we'd be going backwards. I think a lot of the things that are happening right now in our community that drives fear in me as well. That we need to come up with better community solutions, also getting community to work with our police. I feel like there's like everybody's trying to win an argument about more police, less police. And quite frankly, I think that we need to actually come together and work on some of these issues. I think that there's a proven way that we could reduce violence, carjackings, shootings, gun violence, which is to do a focused deterrence. And so I've been working on trying to get our community doing that type of project where the police are very integral to working with community members to, we know oftentimes who these kids are just through some of the data that might exist within police agencies and the data that we have. I think we know some of these kids. And so what focused deterrence is all about is for the police and community to partner together and go and have conversations with these young people and their guardians or parents and start working with them and convincing them that they need to stop the violence, right? These types of strategies have been proven to work. I've been working behind the scenes to try to get St. Paul to embrace that notion. And I have a feeling that in the near future, we'll be able to talk about something that will be announced publicly. But we need to take action. We need to stop the violence. And I think you also need to hear more from your elected officials, not just me, but others, about the fact that this is not okay, that we should not have residents in our community living in fear. And then we should also be talking about strategies about how we're actually going to stop the violence. And I'll be the first to say that we're not going to go backwards in time 20 years ago, like we did when we had this whole notion of juvenile predators and we arrested and prosecuted everything that moved. That would be going backwards in my mind. I think we need to demand community solutions that can actually solve some of these issues.
John, the next question comes from Candy. I think you were starting to address this, so I'll paraphrase a little bit, maybe expand on it. How much of a deterrence effect does the process of arresting and jailing and prosecuting, potentially successfully jailing or sending to prison, how much of a deterrence effect does each step of that have?
Right. I think there's a lot of literature on this. And I think that oftentimes we tend to take our own lived experiences or perspectives and ask ourselves that question: would you be deterred if you were going to be fined if you did X, Y, or Z, or you would be put in jail? And I think for a lot of people, there would be some deterrence effect. But I think for a lot of people who have absolutely nothing to lose, who are living in desperation or under resourced communities, oftentimes the way that people might think of what the response might be, I think is very different. And there's a lot of study and data about that. And I think that we should recognize that and start thinking about and not falsely believing that somehow what police and what I can do and what a jury can do really also prevents crime. I think the only thing it really does is that it does do, and if it's a serious crime and people are sent to prison, we incapacitate somebody for a while, but oftentimes I think when people come in, we have to realize that incapacitation is only for a limited time period. For the felonies that we convict on and there's a prison sentence, the vast majority of those prison sentences are not going to be a life prison term. They're going to be a shorter duration. They're going to come back. And oftentimes I see that the correction system, doesn't necessarily produce people who are necessarily rehabilitated. We have a one-size-fits-all type of system around corrections, around rehabilitation, punishment. We've devised prisons, and we kind of put everything into that bucket. And I think that we should demand better outcomes and results from our prison system, but also recognize that it's not necessarily delivering everything that we want in the long term. In fact, in the short term, it might, but in the long term, it may not.
Thank you. The next question comes from Carol Quest. What is the most proactive change you can recommend to improve the court system today?
Well, I think one thing is to pay attention to it. oftentimes I think people don't pay that much attention to what happens in court unless it's a really high profile case. And so, but I think that I would ask people to pay attention to it in a thoughtful way, to read about the conversations that we're having about criminal justice reform and about racial equity and who's in our prisons, right? And to come to the table with some knowledge about that, and then to deeply think about like, what is it that we want from our courts? Because quite frankly, we have done the same thing since the genesis of this country. And as we have had more and more cases presented to our offices across the country where courts have gotten more cases, we have developed an assembly line system of justice that tries to process this huge volume of cases. And we quickly got away from this notion that everybody can have a jury trial. They can't. And then somehow we developed this plea bargaining process, and this is the system that we have. And how many of us on this call have actually questioned whether or not that system actually delivers what we want? So I think it's really important for people in this community to think about what they want from their court system, like they want it to deliver. And I think what they would want is that they would want accountability for the harm that somebody caused to another. We would want the victim to be restored, right? We would want some measure of assurance and rehabilitation that the conduct will not be repeated. And oftentimes what I see are broken people in the criminal justice system. And so what are the root causes of all of that? And how can we address some of those issues? And ask ourselves the question, does the current system of what we do actually deliver those outcomes? What I see oftentimes are people who come out of prison more broken than they came in. I see a criminal justice system that's asked to respond to just about everything. And I see huge, massive disparity. It hasn't been adequately questioned. So I think one of the first things is that for people to I think about those things and then observe and be more involved in the court processes. And certainly, my role as a prosecutor, I'd love to hear from more people after they've had the opportunity to think about some of those issues and think about ways that we can actually think about doing things maybe in a different way. Because the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And I fear that what we've been doing is ultimately doing the same thing over and over again, and we don't get different results.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from the community that are kind of related, so I'll group them. One comes from Michelle Molstead. How can the community participate in community solutions, including on that focused deference you're discussing?
Right. So I think a part of the focused deterrence relies very heavily on partnerships with the police. So oftentimes, if we're talking about a certain community where there's lots of shootings and violence happening, it's really critical that there are members of that community that can provide the moral voice. The moral voice being saying that, knock it off. We don't want you to do this. We live here too. And we're with them, the police. But what I'm seeing happening in the context of today and civil unrest and all of the issues that we have of the day, some of those relationships are being fractured. But I think we have to figure out ways to bring it together. I hate this kind of dichotomy that we have of either or this binary choice. And quite frankly, I think the solutions lie with everybody working and pulling together. And that's what I would like to see happen more. And I am working on trying to bring leaders from across our spectrum of systems and community together to stop arguing and to really focus on doing what the public deserves, which is a coordinated effort on reducing violence and creating a better community.
Thank you. A follow-up question or comment from Kathy Bell. This was related to that Sibley Banner area. Sadly, a kid could rob or carjack or burglarize the wrong person and pay for it with their life. Wouldn't it be better to get them off the street and into a program where they wouldn't be at that risk?
Right, potentially, but if we got them off the street, it would only be for 6 months or for a year. That's the way our correction system does it. And even despite, let's say that we felt strongly that it should end up that way, we don't make that decision. The decision will ultimately be made by a judge in Ramsey County. And again, I just want to be very clear that the system that we have, that we live in now, is a system that believes, with respect to youth cases, that we need to do everything that we can around rehabilitation.
Very good. I think that is all for our queue of questions. Are there any other comments or questions from the group?
Oh, and then one of my staff people are here today, Erica Schumacher, and thank you, Erica, for putting into the chat request for anybody who wants to email us about getting more information about focused deterrence. You can send us an email and we'll provide you updates. This is something that I've been working on for years, but have been unsuccessful in trying to get all of the stars to align. But I think we might be close to trying to get people to work together and recognize that a focused deterrence model is one that can actually work, because it's been proven to work across the country.
I think we might have an additional question or comment. Matthews Hollinshead, did you have any comment?
Kevin, I do.
Can't hear you, Matthew.
Matt, I think you're on mute. Let me try to unmute you myself.
Oh,
There you go. You're live.
okay. It seems that the assumption that underlies most of what we do relating to crime is that almost anybody is rehabilitatable. You can rehabilitate almost anybody. I personally just think there are some people who are done. They're just lost. And what do we do about those people? Even kids. There are some kids who are just gone. They're not going to come back. They're not going to be productive members of society. And it frustrates me greatly. As some of you know, we've had 2 very, very violent assaults on my block in the last year. And I submit that the people who committed that level of violence are lost. They're not they can't be rehabilitated. And what do we do with those people? What do we do with those people? It's very frustrating.
Yeah, well, I'd be willing to bet that that person that you're talking about probably ends up in prison. But in order to get their case, moving along, it takes, right now in the pandemic, they're going to be in the status of pre-conviction, assuming that they're guilty. I don't know anything about the case, but.
Okay, I think there was one other hand up, and then Tim, I saw your question in writing, so I'll cover it there if that's all right. I heard I believe a female voice. Did somebody have one?
Yes, Kevin, Kate.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
John, my question is, you've mentioned rehab, and I think it's a great idea, especially for the youth and the youngsters and everything. I know the mayor has suggested spending more money in community eds. Do you think that's an effective way of trying to help the youngsters and the teenagers in the city?
Yes and no. I think in the long term, yes. But in the short term, there are services and things that we need to better coordinate on. And I think implement things like focused deterrence, and that will cost money as well. So, I think in order to have some effective strategies around violence, I think that there's the long game about investing in a number of things that are focused around youth and families that could, I think, make a difference over time. But I think that we need to also focus on the short term as well, that we need to immediately figure out ways to intervene and disrupt violence. And again, there's proven strategies to do that. If you just Google focused deterrence, you'll find a lot of information about what other communities are doing about it. Erica just sent you some information about the work at John Jay College, which I'm very connected to. I have been very involved with the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College, and that is where some of the work around focused deterrence and group violence intervention is housed. And so I would love to be able to find a way to bring it here to St. Paul.
And follow up to that, then, John, how do we as citizens and residents, how can we help support that? I'm happy to do the research and check out focused deterrence, but how can we help that?
Right. So I think one of the things is the first thing is that because of the efforts of the new administration, they're going to give a lot of money to local units of government as a part of the economic recovery. And I don't think that there will be lots of strings attached to how that money would be utilized by counties and cities. And so my hope is that they would put a big chunk of that money into the short-term public safety issues, and to really ramp up some of these strategies on the short term, and then also really invest on the long term. And the mayor's been a really good advocate of identifying where we could spend some of that money. But I think that could actually make a difference, not just for today, but also for future generations as well. So I'd love to see that. And so I think just contacting city and county leaders, because that time is going to come about when we start thinking about the next budget. There is going to be an infusion from the federal government. And I think as a value, there's many ways that we can spend that money. I just hope to God that it will be involved with trying to address violence, so that we actually want to have strategies that reduce it in the short term, and then address some of the long-term needs that I think many under-resourced communities and over-policed communities have been experiencing that we need to make right. So that would be one way of just, talking to elected officials. I think the second thing is to support efforts like what's happening in the county. We're doing something called Transforming Systems Together, where the county has allocated budget dollars for initiatives that can create good outcomes in our justice system and in how we serve our community. And I think one particular way is to really invest in some of the youth programming that we have. And so that's an effort where system leaders and community members who have been chosen through a process are coming to the table to kind of think about how we can spend, I think it's about $3 million that has been put aside for that. And so I'm excited about the possibility there that we could develop something with our community, especially the community that's been the most impacted by the justice system. And so that I'm looking forward to that. I also think there's a great opportunity, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about Boys Totem Town, but I had nothing to do with the decision. But the decision was made that facility was to close, right? But that land is valuable, and I don't know what ideas that the county might have for that particular land, but I think it'd be great if we could capture the increment of if that land became property tax generating in some way. Right now it's zero. There's no tax dollars that are generated, but it would be great if we could figure out a way to capture all of that increment and put it into, and the increment would be the resulting, additional tax revenue that's generated for the county and the city and the school district. That could be used for investments in youth to work on prevention and intervention.
Thank you.
Thank you. We did want to try to keep it to an hour, so I think we have one more hand up. Tim, I'm hoping your resources questions were answered during that. And I see that Erica has contributed some more in the chat if you want to check that out. So I'll call on Randall. Randall, if you have a question or comment, you may go ahead.
Yes, hi. Yes, hi, and I'll make it quick. This is a great presentation. Thank you, Mr. Choi. My question was just over the summer, in the cities, there was a lot of talk about defunding the police.
Right.
And it's out of the news, at least as far as I know. And I wondered if that's still kind of an active initiative and how much it's carrying across different communities, or perhaps it's subsided. How's the resourcing going?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, this is really more of a Minneapolis conversation that's going on.
Okay.
I think in St. Paul, the dynamic in the conversation is a little bit different. I mean, it might be about maybe, shifting resources and, prioritizing certain calls that could be handled by people that aren't the police, maybe
Okay.
the fire department, things like that. But I also think that there's a lot of questions about what does defund the police mean, right? It can mean, I think, a lot of different things. The one thing that I actually like about the conversation, I'm not a proponent of like just defund the police. It's like that's a bumper sticker. It's not a
Sure.
solution, right? But I am very supportive of this notion that you and I and the rest of the public should have control over the police, meaning that
Yeah.
civilian police control is just tantamount to our future. And quite frankly, if you think about it, for a really long time, we've been asleep at the switch. I mean, we haven't had much civilian control over policing. And what I mean by that is like, who came up with all of these rules about how they would train police, how we would have expectations, et cetera. The police for the public, for the most part, was very deferential historically. And I think now we're seeing some things that we're not liking about police violence and all of these things. And I think it's so important that communities, start thinking about like, what kind of policing do they want? And I do believe that the majority of people still want policing. We just want better policing that doesn't result in such disparate outcomes, policing that might take into account more notions of de-escalation, things like that. And so I think it's just really important for all of us to be paying attention to what's happening within policing, but also too, that we have to recognize that there's that they're needed. And if you think about like just everything that they've been going through over the past year, I fear that they're just getting too many of the wrong messages from maybe it's not too many of us, it's just few of us, but we need to recalibrate this conversation. And I feel like police feel isolated, ostracized. I think they're very much a part of the solution to having healthy communities. We just need to have policing show up in a way that's just consistent with what you want, Randall, what I want, what citizens want, right?
Yes.
And we're just going through that time period right now. But I am someone that wants police to be at the table. I don't like this argument of people, fighting each other and saying we don't need the police, and the police feeling very defensive and feeling they gotta, right? And then they gotta do their thing. And it leads us to a place called somewhere nowhere or not good. We're not better off in that regard. So I hope that we can start having some conversations where we start walking towards each other and recognizing that the public really wants this all to work in a way that we still have policing, but we're thinking about what kind of policing that we want.
Okay.
And you should all be thinking about what kind of prosecution that you want as well. I believe in civilian oversight over the work that I do. I always say that my job is to connect the values of my community to the work that happens in this office.
Well, with that, that's a very
you so
uplifting
much.
way to wrap up the meeting. So
Yes.
thank you to Ramsey County Attorney John Choi and to Erica Schumacher for participating today. Excellent questions, everybody. We'll do our best to capture these comments. And if you have any questions, just email info@highlanddistrictcouncil.org, and we'll do our best to follow up with you. So thank you all for participating.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Kevin.
Good night.
Hi, Kev.
Hi, Kathy. Lisa's just off screen here too. I'm trying to